Rain falls on Kitakyushu tonight, just as it did on that February morning in 2002 when neighbors noticed something was wrong. The Ogata family home stood quiet, too quiet, on a residential street where children usually played and housewives exchanged morning greetings. But on this day, the silence felt different, heavier, like the air itself knew what lay inside those walls. What the police would discover when they finally entered that house would shake Japan to its core and reveal a darkness so profound that even veteran detectives would struggle to comprehend it. Before we step through that door, before we see what they saw, there's something you need to understand about the man who orchestrated this nightmare, a man whose methods were so insidious that his victims never even tried to escape. If you're listening from Tokyo, Osaka, or anywhere across Japan, the United States, Canada, the UK, or anywhere else in the world, it's just past midnight now, the perfect time to settle in with these dark truths that your textbooks never taught you. Before we continue, if you're finding this case as compelling as I am, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into true crime's darkest corners. His name was Futoshi Matsunaga, and by the time authorities connected him to the Ogata family, he had already perfected his technique over nearly 2 decades. But the truly horrifying part, the detail that makes this case unlike any other, is that Matsunaga never physically restrained his victims. He never needed to, because what he did to their minds was far more effective than any chain or lock could ever be. The neighbors had noticed the Ogata family becoming more reclusive over the past year, their once vibrant household growing dimmer, quieter, isolated. They attributed it to normal family troubles, perhaps financial stress or illness, the kind of private struggles that polite neighbors don't inquire about too deeply. They were wrong. Inside that house, a psychological horror was unfolding that would ultimately claim 7 lives, but not through quick violence. No, these deaths would come slowly, methodically, through a process of systematic dehumanization that turned family members against each other until they became both victims and perpetrators. When police finally forced entry on February 18, 2002, they found only one survivor, a 17-year-old girl who weighed barely 30 kilograms, her body covered in scars, her eyes hollow with trauma that would take years to even begin processing. She was the daughter, the one who had endured everything, witnessed everything, and her testimony would eventually expose one of the most disturbing criminal minds in modern Japanese history. But to understand how this happened, how an entire family could be systematically destroyed from within, we need to go back to where it all began, back to 1981, when Futoshi Matsunaga was just a young man with a mobile phone business and a talent for reading people's weaknesses. But first, there's something else you need to know about the house itself, something the police noticed immediately that made them realize this wasn't just a crime scene, this was a laboratory. And what do you think they found in the bathroom that made even hardened investigators turn away? Futoshi Matsunaga was born in 1961 in Kitakyushu, the same city where his crimes would later unfold, and from an early age, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to manipulate those around him. His childhood friends would later describe him as charming and persuasive, the kind of person who could talk his way into or out of anything. But beneath that charm lay something colder, a calculating intelligence that viewed other people not as humans but as instruments to be played. By his early 20s, Matsunaga had already begun experimenting with the psychological techniques that would define his later crimes. He would identify vulnerable individuals, usually women, befriend them, seduce them, and then slowly, methodically, begin to isolate them from their support networks. His method was elegant in its simplicity. He would start with compliments and attention, making his target feel special, seen, understood in ways they had never experienced before. Once emotional dependence was established, he would introduce small criticisms, tiny seeds of doubt about their friends, their family, their own judgment. These criticisms would grow, becoming more frequent and more severe, until the victim began to believe that Matsunaga was the only person who truly understood them, the only one who could help them navigate their inadequacies. And then, once they were completely isolated, completely dependent, he would introduce pain. For those of you listening in London, the United States, Canada, Tokyo, Osaka, or anywhere around the world right now, it's early evening, that quiet time before the city settles into night, and you might wonder how someone like Matsunaga could exist in modern society, how his victims could be so thoroughly controlled without anyone noticing. But that's the genius of psychological torture. It leaves no visible marks, at least not at first. If the story is gripping you the way it should, Please subscribe, like this video, and turn on your notifications. Your support helps us bring you more cases like this one. The pain started small, always a pinch, a slap, nothing that would leave lasting evidence. But it was the context that mattered. Matsunaga would frame the violence as deserved punishment, as necessary correction for the victim's failures. He would make them repeat phrases acknowledging their wrongdoing, make them thank him for caring enough to discipline them. Over time, the victims internalized this logic. They began to believe they deserved the punishment, that they were fundamentally flawed, and that Matsunaga's violence was an expression of love, of his commitment to making them better. This is called coercive control, a pattern of behavior designed to make a person dependent by isolating them from support, exploiting their resources, and regulating their everyday behavior. And Matsunaga had mastered it years before psychologists even had a name for it. By 1982, Matsunaga had already victimized multiple women, draining their bank accounts, destroying their relationships, and discarding them when they no longer served his purposes. But he wanted more. He wanted complete control, the kind that wouldn't end when the money ran out or when the victim became too damaged to be useful. He wanted a system, a self-sustaining cycle of abuse that could continue indefinitely. And then he met Junko Ogata. Junko was different from his previous victims. She was stronger-willed, more intelligent, more capable of seeing through his manipulations. But that only made her more appealing to Matsunaga, because if he could break someone like Junko, if he could turn her into his instrument, then there would be no limit to what he could achieve. Their relationship began in 1982, and for the first few years, it followed his usual pattern: seduction, isolation, gradual escalation of control and violence. But Junko resisted in ways his previous victims hadn't. She fought back. She questioned. She tried to leave multiple times. So Matsunaga adapted. He realized that to truly control Junko, he needed to give her someone else to control, someone weaker, someone she could dominate in the same way he dominated her. This would serve two purposes. It would satisfy Junko's need for agency and power, making her less likely to rebel against him, and it would implicate her in his crimes, binding her to him through shared guilt. The psychological term for this is forced perpetration, where victims are coerced into harming others, creating trauma bonds that make escape psychologically almost impossible. And that's when Matsunaga made his most diabolical decision, a plan so twisted that when it was finally revealed in court, even the prosecutor struggled to explain it to the jury, because who would believe that a man could convince a woman to help him torture her own family to death? In 1985, Matsunaga identified his next target, and this time, he chose someone even closer to Junko, someone whose suffering would bind Junko to him more completely than anything he had done before. He chose Junko's own family. The Ogata family consisted of Junko's parents, Shizumi and Takashige, her younger sister Riko, and Riko's two children. They were a normal middle-class family, hardworking, close-knit, the kind of people who never imagined they could become victims of the horror that was about to consume them. Matsunaga's approach was patient and methodical. He began by ingratiating himself with the family, presenting himself as Junko's devoted boyfriend, a successful businessman who could provide for their daughter. He was charming, generous, attentive, everything parents hope their daughter will find in a partner. Over months and years, he became a fixture in their lives, someone they trusted, someone they welcomed into their home without reservation. And all the while, he was studying them, learning their weaknesses, their fears, their pressure points. By 1996, Matsunaga had convinced the Ogata family to let him move into their home, ostensibly to save money while he expanded his business. This was the crucial step because once inside, he could begin the real work of dismantling their family structure and rebuilding it with himself at the center. He started with Takashige, Junko's father, a proud man in his 60s who had worked his entire life to provide for his family. Matsunaga began to undermine Takashige's authority through subtle means, questioning his decisions, offering better alternatives, positioning himself as the more capable problem solver. At first, Takashige resisted, but Matsunaga was patient, and he had Junko's help, whether she fully understood what she was doing or not. If you're in New York City, Los Angeles, Toronto, London, Tokyo, or anywhere else around the globe right now, it's late afternoon, that golden hour before sunset, and you might be listening to this on your commute home, surrounded by thousands of people, and it's worth remembering that horror doesn't just happen in isolated places, it happens in ordinary homes, on ordinary streets, hidden behind ordinary facades. Take a second to subscribe if you haven't already, smash that like button, and turn on notifications. It really helps us continue investigating cases that deserve to be told. The isolation of the family began gradually. Matsunaga convinced them that they were being cheated by their relatives, that friends were taking advantage of them, that the outside world was hostile and dangerous. He controlled their finances, monitoring every expense and criticizing any spending he deemed unnecessary. He controlled their communication, screening phone calls and letters, ensuring that their contact with the outside world flowed through him. And slowly, inexorably, the Ogata family's world shrank until it consisted only of their house and the people inside it. Then came the violence. It started with Takashige. Matsunaga accused him of disrespecting Junko and demanded an apology. When Takashige refused, Matsunaga slapped him across the face. The shock of this moment cannot be overstated. In Japanese culture, the respect for elders is paramount, and the idea of a younger man striking an elder, particularly in his own home, was almost incomprehensible. But what happened next was even more incomprehensible. Matsunaga forced Junko to participate, to join in punishing her father for his disrespect. And she did. Whether through fear, through her own internalized abuse, or through the twisted logic Matsunaga had instilled in her, Junko struck her father. This was the turning point, the moment when the family's destruction became inevitable, because once that line was crossed, once family members could be made to hurt each other, Matsunaga could construct his system of mutual degradation. He introduced a rule: anyone who broke the household rules would be punished, and everyone else would participate in that punishment, or they themselves would be punished. This created a cycle where everyone was both victim and perpetrator, where guilt and trauma bonded them together in a way that made escape psychologically impossible. The punishments escalated. Physical beatings became routine. Electric shocks were introduced. Matsunaga had rigged up a device that could deliver painful jolts, and he would use this on family members for infractions as minor as speaking without permission or making eye contact without being told to do so. Food was restricted, with family members sometimes going days without eating, and when they were fed, it was often scraps or deliberately disgusting combinations designed to humiliate. Sleep deprivation was constant. Matsunaga would wake family members at random hours to confess their wrongdoings or to participate in punishment sessions. But the physical abuse, as horrifying as it was, wasn't the worst part, because what Matsunaga did next would ensure that even if the family wanted to escape, even if they somehow found the courage to run, there was something that would make that impossible, something that would trap them more effectively than any lock or chain ever could. And can you guess what psychological technique he used to make his victims police themselves? Matsunaga's true genius, if such a word can be applied to something so evil, lay in creating a system where the victims controlled themselves and each other, making his constant presence unnecessary. He called it the confession system, and it worked like this. Every family member was required to confess their bad thoughts and actions every day, no matter how minor. These confessions were written down and reviewed by Matsunaga and Junko, who would then determine the appropriate punishment. But here's the crucial part. If one family member failed to report another's transgression, both would be punished, the original offender for the offense and the witness for failing to report it. This system turned the family against itself. Parents informed on children, siblings betrayed siblings. Everyone became both warden and prisoner in a panopticon of mutual surveillance. Trust, the foundation of family bonds, was systematically destroyed and replaced with suspicion and fear. Family members began to over-report, inventing or exaggerating transgressions to demonstrate their loyalty to Matsunaga, knowing that being seen as complicit was more dangerous than being seen as a victim. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Research on thought reform and coercive control shows that when people are forced to repeatedly confess to crimes or moral failures, they begin to internalize the guilt, their sense of self becomes eroded, replaced by the identity that the confessor assigns to them. In the case of the Ogata family, they began to genuinely believe they were bad people, fundamentally flawed and deserving of punishment. And because everyone in the house shared this belief, there was no one to challenge it, no alternative reality to cling to. For those listening in Sydney, Melbourne, Vancouver, Chicago, Manchester, Osaka, or anywhere you're tuning in from, where morning is breaking and a new day begins, it might be hard to imagine how this could happen, how educated adults could be so thoroughly controlled. But that's the power of environment. When everyone around you confirms the same reality, when there's no external reference point, that reality becomes truth, no matter how distorted it might be. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our investigations into the darkest corners of true crime. By 1997, the Ogata family had been living under Matsunoga's control for over a year, and the physical evidence of their abuse was becoming harder to hide. Family members had lost significant weight. Their bodies bore scars from repeated beatings and electric shocks, and their behavior had become noticeably strange, withdrawn, fearful, submissive. But Matsunoga had prepared for this. The family had been so thoroughly isolated that there was virtually no contact with the outside world. The few times neighbors or distant relatives inquired about them, Matsunoga had prepared scripts, explanations about illness or family troubles that satisfied curiosity without inviting intervention. The confession system evolved to include more elaborate punishments. Family members were forced to torture each other in increasingly creative ways, with the understanding that failure to inflict sufficient pain would result in even worse punishment for both the reluctant torturer and their intended victim. Matsunoga would sometimes leave the house for days, leaving Junko in charge, and the system would continue to function in his absence, a testament to how thoroughly he had internalized his control in each family member. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case, revealed later through the survivor's testimony, was the way Matsunoga used intimacy and affection as weapons. He would occasionally show kindness to a family member, offering them food or relief from punishment, and this intermittent reinforcement, this unpredictable alternation between cruelty and kindness, created a psychological dependency known as trauma bonding. Victims in such situations often develop intense emotional attachments to their abusers, viewing the rare moments of kindness as proof that the abuser really does care, that if the victim could just be better, the abuse would stop. The family's living conditions deteriorated progressively. They were confined to smaller and smaller areas of the house, eventually restricted to a single room where they slept on bare floors with minimal bedding. Hygiene was controlled and restricted, bathing was rare and supervised, waste removal was humiliating and regulated. The house itself became a physical manifestation of their psychological prison, with each room representing a different level of degradation and control. And then in late 1997, something happened that would transform this case from psychological torture into murder, because one family member, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, made a decision that would seal the fate of everyone in that house. But who was it, and what did they do that made Matsunoga decide death was the only solution? Takashi Ogata, Junko's father, had endured nearly 2 years of systematic abuse by late 1997. The proud man who had once been the head of his household had been reduced to a shell, beaten, starved, and humiliated beyond recognition. But somewhere deep inside, some spark of his former self remained, some small ember of resistance that Matsunoga's techniques hadn't quite extinguished. And that spark would prove fatal. The exact nature of Takashi's defiance remains unclear. December 1997, different accounts suggest committed some act of resistance significant enough that Matsunoga decided he could no longer be controlled. He had become a liability. In Matsunoga's twisted logic, Takashi had to be eliminated, but simply killing him wasn't enough. The murder had to serve a purpose. It had to reinforce control over the remaining family members. So Matsunoga devised a plan that was as brilliant as it was horrifying. He would make the family kill Takashi themselves. The process began with a family meeting. Matsunoga explained that Takashi had committed unforgivable offenses, that he had disrespected the family, endangered everyone with his behavior, and that the only solution was the ultimate punishment. He then asked each family member, one by one, if they agreed that Takashi deserved to die. In the environment he had created, where disagreement meant punishment and agreement meant complicity, each family member nodded their assent. Even Shizumi, Takashi's wife of over 30 years, even Riko, his daughter. They had been so thoroughly broken that they could be made to participate in condemning their husband and father to death. If you're listening from Tokyo, Osaka, or anywhere in Japan, the morning light is beginning to break now, that quiet time before the city wakes, and perhaps you're wondering how this could happen in modern Japan, a society known for its order and social cohesion. But that's precisely the point. These mechanisms of control work everywhere, in every culture, because they exploit universal human vulnerabilities. The actual murder was carried out over several days in a process Matsunaga called correctional training. Takashige was subjected to escalating physical abuse, with each family member required to participate in beating him, shocking him with electricity, and depriving him of food and water. The goal, Matsunaga explained, was to help Takashige understand the severity of his wrongdoing, but everyone understood what was really happening. They were killing him slowly, and they were all doing it together. Takashige died on December 6, 1997, his body so damaged from sustained abuse that when the medical examiner later reviewed the evidence, he struggled to catalog all the injuries. But Takashige's death wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, because now Matsunaga had to dispose of the body. And here again, his genius for psychological torture manifested in the most disturbing way possible. He announced that the family would dispose of the body together. They would dismember it and destroy it, ensuring that their complicity in Takashige's death was absolute and undeniable. The dismemberment took place in the bathroom, that room the police would later find so disturbing. Family members were assigned different tasks, some to cut, some to dispose of remains, some to clean. Matsunaga supervised, ensuring everyone participated, ensuring everyone's hands were literally bloodied. The remains were disposed of through various means over several weeks, some parts burned, some dissolved in chemicals, some disposed of in different locations, a process that ensured complete destruction and made recovery of evidence virtually impossible. The psychological impact of this forced participation cannot be overstated. Research on perpetrator trauma shows that when people are forced to commit acts of violence, particularly against loved ones, they experience profound psychological damage that can be more severe than being a victim of violence. The family members who participated in dismembering Takashige were traumatized in ways that made their already fragile psychological states even more vulnerable to Matsunaga's control. They now carried the unbearable weight of having killed and dismembered their own family member. A guilt so profound that escape became unthinkable, because escape would mean facing what they had done. But Matsunaga wasn't finished, because he had discovered something in the process of Takashige's murder. He had discovered that making the family kill for him was the ultimate form of control, and if it worked once, why not do it again and again until everyone who might resist was gone? And who do you think was next on his list? After Takashige's murder, the atmosphere in the Ogata house changed, becoming darker, more desperate, more resigned. The family members who remained, Shizumi, Riko's two children, and Junko, now carried the knowledge of what they had done, and that knowledge bound them to Matsunaga and to each other in ways that made escape psychologically impossible. They were no longer just victims, they were accomplices, and in Matsunaga's carefully constructed reality, they deserved everything that was happening to them. Matsunaga's control intensified after Takashige's death. The confession sessions became more elaborate and more humiliating, with family members required to confess not just their actions but their thoughts, their dreams, their most private feelings. The punishments became more severe, as Matsunaga seemed to be testing the limits of how much pain and degradation human beings could endure. And through it all, Junko served as his lieutenant, enforcing his rules, administering his punishments, becoming so thoroughly identified with her abuser that it became difficult to know where Matsunaga's will ended and her own began. The next target was Shizumi, Junko's mother and Takashige's widow. After her husband's murder, Shizumi had fallen into deep depression, becoming even more withdrawn and non-responsive than before. Matsunaga viewed this as defiance, as a refusal to participate fully in the household system, and he decided that she too had become a liability. In early 1998, he began the same process with Shizumi that he had used with Takashige, escalating abuse framed as correctional training designed to fix her bad attitude. For those in London, Dublin, Boston, Seattle, Hong Kong, or wherever you are in the world experiencing the quiet of evening, it's worth reflecting on how isolation enables these horrors. In a city of millions, someone can be suffering unspeakable abuse just meters away, and no one knows, no one intervenes, because the walls between us are not just physical but psychological. We assume that if something terrible was happening, we would hear it, we would see signs, we would know, but we almost never do. If you're appreciating this deep dive, please subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our coverage of cases that matter. Shizumi's murder followed the same pattern as Takeshi's: systematic abuse involving all family members, culminating in death, followed by forced dismemberment and disposal of remains. But this time, the process was faster, more efficient. Matsunaga had refined his technique. Shizumi died in March 1998, and within days, her body had been completely destroyed, with family members once again forced to participate in every stage of the process. The bathroom saw its second dismemberment, the chemicals were purchased and used again, the disposal methods that had worked before were employed once more. With both parents dead, Riko, Junko's younger sister, became the eldest member of the original Ogata family still alive in the house. Riko had her own 2 children, a daughter and a son, and in the aftermath of her parents' murders, she began to realize the full horror of the situation. Unlike Junko, who had been with Matsunaga for over 15 years and whose personality had been almost completely subsumed by his control, Riko had only been under his direct control for about 2 years. She still had some sense of self, some ability to think independently, some capacity for resistance. And that made her dangerous. Riko began to make small attempts at rebellion, nothing overt enough to trigger immediate punishment, but subtle acts of defiance that Matsunaga recognized for what they were. She would take slightly longer than permitted to complete tasks. She would make eye contact when she wasn't supposed to. She would comfort her children in ways that weren't explicitly forbidden but that Matsunaga understood as attempts to preserve a bond that existed outside his control. These small acts of resistance were actually incredibly brave, but they were also fatal, because Matsunaga could not allow any alternative center of loyalty or authority to exist in his carefully constructed system. The decision to kill Riko was made in mid-1998, but this time, Matsunaga introduced a new element to his plan. He would make Riko's own children participate in her murder. This served multiple purposes in his twisted logic. It would eliminate any loyalty the children felt toward their mother, binding them even more completely to him. It would demonstrate to Junko that even parent-child bonds could be severed through his methods, reinforcing his absolute control, and it would create a level of trauma in the children that would make them completely malleable for whatever purposes he had planned for them. The process of forcing children to torture and kill their own mother represents such a profound evil that when it was revealed in court, even experienced prosecutors wept openly. But how did Matsunaga convince these children to do it? What psychological techniques could possibly be powerful enough to make a child raise their hand against their own mother? And what happened to those children afterward? Riko's daughter was 14 years old in 1998. Her son was 10, and both had been living under Matsunaga's control for approximately 2 years. They had witnessed the murders of their grandparents, they had been forced to participate in the disposal of their bodies, and they had been subjected to the same regimen of abuse, starvation, and psychological torture as the adults. But children's minds are different from adult minds, more plastic, more vulnerable, more capable of adapting to even the most horrific circumstances, and Matsunaga understood this. He understood that these children could be shaped into whatever he needed them to be. The process of preparing the children to kill their mother began weeks before the actual murder. Matsunaga started by intensifying his criticism of Riko in front of her children, pointing out her failures, her selfishness, her bad thoughts. He would frame these criticisms as concerns for the children's well-being, explaining that Riko's badness was infecting them, making them bad too, and that the only way to save themselves was to separate from her influence. The children, already traumatized and desperate for any source of approval or safety in their nightmare existence, began to internalize these messages. Next, Matsunaga introduced the idea that the children needed to help correct their mother, to help her become better through punishment. This started small, with the children required to report their mother's infractions, then to participate in minor punishments, slaps, or denial of food. Each time they complied, Matsunaga praised them, telling them they were being strong, being good, being better than their weak mother. This positive reinforcement for harming their mother created a profound cognitive dissonance in the children, but in the absence of any alternative framework, any voice telling them this was wrong, they adapted by accepting Matsunaga's logic. If you're in New York City, Toronto, Los Angeles, London, Sydney, Tokyo, or anywhere else right now, the sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and life continues its normal rhythm. But for those children, there was no normal, there was only survival, and survival meant doing what Matsunaga said, no matter how incomprehensible, no matter how terrible. Your engagement keeps this channel going, so please subscribe if you haven't, hit that like button, and turn on notifications for more true crime investigations. The murder of Rico began in late 1998 and followed the same pattern as the previous killings. Escalating abuse framed as correction, with all household members required to participate. But this time, the children were given prominent roles. They were required to administer electric shocks, to deny their mother food, to beat her when she failed to confess her wrongdoings adequately. Matsunaga carefully calibrated the children's participation, pushing them to do things that seemed impossible, then praising them lavishly when they complied, creating a cycle of trauma and reward that further eroded their moral framework. Rico died in January 1999, her body broken by months of sustained abuse from her own children and her sister. The dismemberment that followed was perhaps the most traumatic aspect for the children, because unlike the previous killings where they had been peripheral participants, this time Matsunaga made them central to the process. They were required to cut, to separate, to dispose, to confront the physical reality of what they had done to the woman who had given them life. The daughter, in particular, struggled with this task, and Matsunaga punished her repeatedly for her weakness, for her tears, for her hesitation, until she learned to perform even this horror with blank-faced compliance. The psychological damage inflicted on these children during this period is almost incomprehensible. Child psychologists who later worked with the surviving daughter identified complex trauma patterns consistent with severe child abuse, including dissociation, learned helplessness, and what's called betrayal trauma, the specific damage that occurs when a child is harmed by someone they depend on for survival. But in this case, the betrayal was multidirectional. The children had been betrayed by the adults who should have protected them, and they had been forced to betray their mother, creating layers of trauma that would take years to even begin addressing. After Rico's death, only 5 people remained in the house: Matsunaga, Junko, Rico's 2 children, and one other person we haven't discussed yet, someone who had been brought into the household more recently, someone who would become Matsunaga's next target. But before we discuss that person, it's important to understand what the house had become by 1999. It was no longer a home in any recognizable sense. It was a laboratory of human degradation, a place where the normal rules of family, morality, and human decency had been so thoroughly inverted that murder had become routine, where children tortured their parents and thanked their abuser for teaching them discipline. The new target was someone from outside the family, someone Matsunaga had recruited specifically to serve a particular purpose in his expanding system of control. And when you learn who this person was and why Matsunaga brought them into the house, you'll understand that his ambitions extended beyond just one family. He was building something larger, something sustainable, a self-perpetuating machine of abuse that could theoretically continue indefinitely. But who was this new victim, and what role were they meant to play? In 1996, before the murders began, Matsunaga had identified another potential victim, a young man named Kumio Toraya who had been one of his early business associates. Kumio was in his early 30s, had mild intellectual disabilities, and was socially isolated, making him an ideal target for Matsunaga's manipulations. Over several years, Matsunaga had cultivated a relationship with Kumio, positioning himself as a mentor and friend, gradually isolating Kumio from his own family and drawing him deeper into dependence. By 1998, Kumio was living in the Ogata household, having been convinced that he needed to be there to help with family business and to receive Matsunaga's guidance in improving himself. What Kumio didn't understand was that he had been brought there to serve multiple purposes, as additional labor for Matsunaga's schemes, as another participant in the abuse system to further diffuse responsibility, and ultimately, as another victim whose murder would further traumatize and bind the remaining household members. Kumio's presence in the household during 1998 and 1999 meant that he witnessed and participated in the murders of Shizumi and Rico. Like the other household members, he was drawn into the confession system, punished for infractions, and forced to participate in punishing others. His intellectual disabilities made him particularly vulnerable to Matsunaga's manipulations, He accepted the explanations for the violence more readily, questioned the logic less frequently, and complied with directives more completely than others might have. For those listening in Sydney, Brisbane, Vancouver, Miami, Edinburgh, Osaka, or wherever morning is breaking and a new day begins, it might seem impossible that so many people could be controlled by one man, but that's the power of systems. Once established, they become self-reinforcing, each member polices the others, and the cost of defection, of breaking the rules, becomes so high that compliance, no matter how horrible, seems like the only option. Make sure you're subscribed, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to support our ongoing coverage of true crime's most complex cases. But Kumio's usefulness to Matsunaga was limited, and by late 1999, Matsunaga had decided that Kumio too had become a liability. The exact nature of Kumio's offense is unclear. Different accounts suggest he may have failed to adequately participate in punishing others, or may have shown sympathy for the other victims, or may simply have become less useful as Matsunaga's needs evolved. Regardless, the decision was made. Kumio would be the fourth victim. The pattern repeated, escalating abuse framed as correction, forced participation by all household members including Riko's children, culminating in death and dismemberment. Kumio died in early 2000, and his body was disposed of using the same methods that had worked for the previous victims. The bathroom that had seen 3 previous dismemberments saw its fourth. The chemicals were purchased again. The disposal procedures were executed with the efficiency of practice. With Kumio's death, the household was reduced to 4 people: Matsunaga, Junko, and Riko's 2 children, now 15 and 11 years old. The house had become quieter, emptier, heavy with the weight of 4 murders and the trauma of the survivors. But Matsunaga's system continued. The confessions, the punishments, the constant surveillance, all persisted even as the number of participants dwindled. In fact, the reduction in household members made the control even more intense, because there were fewer people among whom to diffuse responsibility and fewer opportunities for private moments of connection that might challenge Matsunaga's authority. The children, who had now participated in the murder and dismemberment of their mother and 3 other people, were psychologically destroyed in ways that are difficult to comprehend. The daughter later testified that during this period she felt like she wasn't real anymore, like she was watching herself from outside her body, a classic symptom of dissociation that occurs when trauma is too severe for the mind to process normally. The son, younger and less able to articulate his experience, simply became quieter and more compliant, a ghost of a child going through the motions of existence without any real connection to life. And then in late 2000, something unexpected happened, something that would ultimately lead to the unraveling of Matsunaga's entire system, because one of the children, pushed beyond even the extraordinary limits they had already endured, made a decision that would set in motion the events leading to discovery. But what was that decision, and why? Did it take so long for the outside world to finally learn what had happened in that house? By late 2000, Matsunaga had been operating his system of control and murder for nearly 4 years, and he had achieved a level of dominance over the remaining household members that seemed absolute. But there was one person in the house whose will had not been completely broken, one person who still harbored thoughts of escape, of ending the nightmare, even if it meant ending their own life. That person was Riko's son, who, despite being only 11 years old, still possessed some spark of resistance that Matsunaga's techniques hadn't fully extinguished. The boy's resistance manifested in small ways: hesitation before following orders, quiet crying when he thought no one could hear, moments of stillness when he seemed to be somewhere else mentally, anywhere else but in that house of horrors. Matsunaga noticed these signs, and he understood what they meant. The boy was still fighting, still hoping, still imagining a life beyond the walls of the Ogata house. And in Matsunaga's logic, that made him dangerous, not because he might physically escape, the boy was too young and too traumatized for that, but because his resistance, however subtle, represented a challenge to the absolute control Matsunaga had worked so hard to establish. In December 2000, Matsunaga made the decision that the boy had to die. But this murder would be different from the previous 4, because this time, the primary executioner would be the boy's own sister, Riko's daughter, who was now 16 years old and who had already been forced to participate in her mother's murder. Matsunaga's reasoning for this arrangement was characteristically twisted. By making the sister kill her brother, He would sever the last familial bond that existed outside his control. He would create a level of guilt and trauma that would make the sister completely dependent on him for any sense of meaning or purpose, and he would demonstrate to Junko the ultimate effectiveness of his methods, that he could make anyone do anything. Even a teenage girl could be made to murder her own younger brother. If you're listening from Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, New York, London, Toronto, or anywhere around the world, the afternoon is settling in now, and perhaps you're wondering how we can know these details, how anyone survived to tell this story, and that's something we'll address soon. But first, you need to understand what happened in those final days of December 2000, because it's important to witness the full extent of this horror, to understand what human beings are capable of doing to each other. When all normal moral constraints are removed, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support means we can continue bringing you thoroughly researched true crime content. The process of conditioning the sister to kill her brother took several weeks. Matsunaga began by intensifying his criticism of the boy in front of his sister, explaining that the boy's bad thoughts and bad attitudes were infecting her, making her bad too. He framed the boy's existence as a burden on the household, a drain on resources, a source of negativity that prevented everyone else from improving. And most critically, he began to suggest that the sister was responsible for her brother, that his failures were her failures, that she would be punished for his infractions unless she took action to correct him. The abuse of the boy escalated rapidly. He was beaten more frequently and more severely, starved for longer periods, subjected to electric shocks for minor infractions. And each time, his sister was required to participate, to administer the punishments, to watch and confirm that the boy deserved what was happening to him. The psychological pressure on the sister was immense. She was being told that she could end her brother's suffering by ending his life, that this would be an act of mercy, that it would free both of them from the impossible situation they were in. The boy died on December 31st, 2000, the last day of the year, the last day of his short life. His death was caused by a combination of starvation, physical trauma, and ultimately, deliberate violence administered primarily by his sister under Matsunaga's direction. The details of the actual killing are too disturbing to recount in full, but what's important to understand is that the sister was forced to be the primary agent of her brother's death. Her hands were the ones that delivered the final blows, even as Matsunaga stood by directing and encouraging. The dismemberment that followed was the fifth such procedure in that bathroom, and by now it had become almost routine, a horrific normalization of the most abnormal act imaginable. The sister participated mechanically, her mind somewhere far away, her body going through the motions of destroying what remained of her younger brother. The disposal followed the established pattern, the same chemicals, the same methods, the same efficiency born of terrible practice. With the boy's death, only 3 people remained in the house: Matsunaga, Junko, and the 16-year-old girl who had now been forced to murder her own mother and brother. And you might think that with the household reduced to just 3 people, with 5 murders completed and concealed, that Matsunaga would stop, that he would be satisfied with his dominance. But you would be wrong, because Matsunaga had one more murder planned, one final victim who had been part of his system from the very beginning. And when you learn who this victim was, you'll understand the true depths of his depravity. By early 2001, the Ogata house had become a tomb, a monument to Matsunaga's twisted genius for control and destruction. 5 people had been murdered within its walls, their bodies dismembered and disposed of, their existence erased as completely as if they had never lived. Only 3 people remained who knew what had happened: Matsunaga himself, Junko Ogata, and Junko's niece, the teenage girl who had survived everything, endured everything, been forced to do things that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But Matsunaga's ambitions hadn't been satisfied. If anything, the success of his previous murders had emboldened him, had proven to him that he could get away with anything, that his methods of control were so effective that he could kill repeatedly without consequence. And as he looked around the house in early 2001, he realized there was one more person who could be eliminated, one more life that could be taken to further demonstrate his absolute power. That person was Junko. Junko Ogata had been with Matsunaga for nearly 20 years by this point. She had been his first long-term victim, his partner in crime, his lieutenant in the abuse and murder of her own family. But she had also been a witness to everything. She knew too much, she had seen too much, and most critically, She represented the last potential challenge to Matsunoga's control over the teenage girl. As long as Junko was alive, the girl might feel some residual family loyalty, some connection to her aunt that existed outside Matsunoga's authority. Eliminating Junko would sever that final connection, leaving the girl completely isolated and completely dependent on Matsunoga alone. For those in London, Manchester, Dublin, Chicago, San Francisco, Melbourne, or wherever you are experiencing the quiet of the evening, it might seem incomprehensible that Matsunoga would kill Junko, the woman who had been his partner for 2 decades, the woman who had helped him commit 5 murders. But that's the nature of psychopathy. There are no real bonds, no genuine connections, only instruments to be used and discarded when they no longer serve their purpose. If you're finding this investigation valuable, please subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications to help us continue this work. The decision to kill Junko was made in March 2001, and Matsunoga began the same process he had used with previous victims: escalating criticism, escalating abuse, escalating punishment framed as correction. But this time, the process was complicated by Junko's unique position. She knew his methods, she understood his techniques, she had helped him develop and refine his system of control. In some ways, she was the most dangerous potential victim because she had the knowledge and experience to potentially resist or expose him. Matsunoga solved this problem by involving the teenage girl even more extensively in Junko's abuse and ultimate murder. He explained to the girl that Junko had been the real architect of the family's suffering, that she had manipulated Matsunoga into doing terrible things, that she was the source of all the badness in the household. This was a complete inversion of reality, but in the hermetically sealed world of the Ogata house, where Matsunoga's word was law and there was no external reference point, it became truth. The girl, desperate for any explanation that might make sense of her nightmare, accepted this narrative, and with acceptance came the willingness to participate in Junko's punishment. Junko's murder was the slowest and most prolonged of all 6 killings. It extended from March through June of 2001, a period of months during which she was systematically tortured, starved, and degraded by the man she had devoted her life to and by her own niece, a girl she had known since birth. The psychological torture was particularly severe, as Matsunoga forced Junko to confess to crimes and moral failures, to accept responsibility for everything that had happened, to acknowledge that she deserved what was being done to her. Junko died in late June 2001, her body so damaged from months of abuse that it was barely recognizable. The dismemberment that followed was the 6th and final such procedure in that bathroom, carried out primarily by the teenage girl under Matsunoga's direction. And with Junko's death, the original Ogata family was completely destroyed. 7 people who had once lived normal lives in that house were all dead, 6 murdered and 1, the girl's brother, who would later be counted among the victims even though his death preceded Junko's. Now only 2 people remained in the house, Matsunoga and the teenage girl, and you might expect that the nightmare would end here, but it didn't, because for the next 9 months, from June 2001 to February 2002, Matsunoga continued his system of control with just 1 victim, and what happened during those 9 months, the daily reality of being the sole survivor in a house of ghosts, would be in some ways even more psychologically damaging than anything that had come before. But how did it finally end? How did the outside world finally learn what had happened in that house? From June 2001 to February 2002, the girl lived alone in the house with Matsunoga, the last living member of the Ogata family, the only person besides Matsunoga who knew what had happened in those walls. She was 17 years old, weighed less than 30 kilograms, and carried the psychological burden of having participated in the murder and dismemberment of 6 people, including her own mother and brother. Her existence during these 9 months was a kind of living death. She went through the motions of daily life, following Matsunoga's rules, confessing her bad thoughts, accepting punishment for infractions, but some essential part of her had departed, fled to somewhere safer, leaving behind only a shell that breathed and moved and obeyed. The confession system continued, even with only 2 people in the house. Every day, the girl was required to write down her bad thoughts and actions, to present them to Matsunoga for review, to accept punishment when her confessions were deemed inadequate or insincere. The punishments continued too: beatings, electric shocks, starvation, All the techniques that had been used on the other victims were now focused solely on her. But in some ways, this period was psychologically worse than when others had been present, because now there was no one else to share the burden, no one else to occasionally absorb Matsunage's attention and violence. It was just her, alone, day after day, month after month. Matsunaga began to talk about the future during this period, about his plans for how they would continue living. He talked about leaving the house eventually, starting over somewhere new, creating a new identity for the girl. He even talked about having her recruit new victims, young women she could befriend and bring into his system, perpetuating the cycle of abuse with a new generation. These conversations were another form of torture, because they forced the girl to imagine a future where the nightmare never ended, where she would spend the rest of her life under his control, possibly even helping him destroy others the way she had been forced to destroy her own family. If you're in New York City, Los Angeles, Vancouver, London, Sydney, Tokyo, or anywhere else where evening is settling and the city's lights are beginning to glow, you might be wondering how the story ends, because it has to end somehow. 9 months of this isolated horror had to lead somewhere, and it did, but not in the way you might expect, because the girl didn't escape, she didn't overpower Matsunaga. She didn't find some hidden reserve of strength and courage to break free. What happened was much more mundane, much more accidental, and yet also somehow more fitting. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you can follow more investigations like this one. In early February 2002, Matsunaga made a mistake. After nearly 6 years of perfect control, of flawless execution of his system, he made one small error that would unravel everything. He allowed the girl to leave the house briefly to go to a local store to buy supplies. This wasn't the first time she had been permitted such errands. Over the years, several household members had been allowed brief, supervised trips outside when necessary, and they had always returned, because psychologically they couldn't imagine doing anything else. The outside world had become alien and terrifying, and the hell they knew seemed safer than the uncertainty of freedom. But this time was different, because this time the girl was completely alone, not just alone on the errand, but alone in the sense that everyone else who had shared her experience was dead. There was no one left to protect by staying, no one left who would be punished if she didn't return. And in that moment, standing in that store, holding the items Matsunaga had sent her to buy, something shifted in her mind. She looked around at the normal people doing normal things, shopping, talking, living their lives, and she realized that this normalcy still existed, that there was a world outside Matsunaga's control, a world she had almost forgotten was real. The girl didn't return to the house. Instead, she walked to a nearby police station, walked through doors she had passed hundreds of times in her life, but had never thought she could enter, and she said words she had never imagined she would be able to say, "I need help." What followed was the largest murder investigation in recent Japanese history. The girl's initial statements to police were fragmented and confusing. She couldn't tell the story chronologically, couldn't explain clearly what had happened, her mind still operating on the logic of Matsunaga's system where everything was her fault, where she was bad and deserved punishment. But slowly, over hours and days, detectives began to piece together the scope of the horror, and when they finally entered the Ogata house with a search warrant on February 18, 2002, they found evidence of crimes so disturbing that even experienced investigators were traumatized. Matsunaga was arrested at the house, and when police confronted him with the evidence they had found, with the tools of torture, the chemical residue, the documentation of his system, he did something that shocked everyone present. He smiled, and then he began to talk, and what he said, the complete lack of remorse he showed, the pride he took in explaining his methods, would ultimately help seal his fate. But what exactly did they find in that house? What physical evidence remained after 6 murders and 6 dismemberments? The Ogata house in February 2002 was a crime scene unlike any other in Japanese history, not because of what was there, but because of what was missing. 6 people had been murdered and dismembered in that house over a 5-year period, but Matsunaga's disposal methods had been so thorough that police found no complete bodies, no major body parts, nothing that could immediately confirm the scope of the crimes the surviving girl was describing. What they did find was a detailed documentation of horror. In the bathroom, investigators discovered chemical residue consistent with the substances used to dissolve organic matter. There were stains that testing would later confirm were human blood, multiple people's blood, layered over years. The floor had been cleaned repeatedly, but luminol testing revealed the ghostly outlines of what had taken place there. The splatter patterns, the drag marks, the evidence of sustained and repeated violence. The bathtub itself had been replaced at least once during the period of the crimes, but the new tub still showed signs of chemical damage consistent with the girl's testimony about how bodies had been disposed of. Throughout the house, police found the tools of Matsunaga's system of control. There were electrical devices rigged to deliver shocks, restraints that showed signs of repeated use, detailed notebooks containing confessions and punishment schedules dating back years. These notebooks were particularly chilling because they were written in multiple hands, showing that the victims themselves had documented their own abuse, had participated in recording their own degradation. The handwriting changed over time as different family members died and others took over the documentation duties, creating a written history of the household's destruction. For those listening in Sydney, Auckland, Perth, Seattle, Boston, Liverpool, or anywhere where morning light is strengthening and a new day fully dawns, it might be hard to imagine how investigators processed this crime scene, how they maintained professional composure while confronting evidence of such systematic cruelty. But they did their jobs. They cataloged every piece of evidence. They built a case that would ultimately bring Matsunaga to justice. If you're still with us, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us tremendously. Financial records found in the house revealed another dimension of Matsunaga's crimes. He had systematically drained the Ogata family's resources over the years, forging signatures, manipulating accounts, stealing everything they had accumulated over lifetimes of work. The family's bank accounts had been emptied, their property had been sold, their possessions had been liquidated, all to fund Matsunaga's lifestyle and schemes. This financial exploitation explained why no one outside the household had raised alarms about the family's disappearance. Matsunaga had carefully maintained the fiction that they had moved away, changed contact information, become reclusive but still existed somewhere. Interviews with neighbors and distant relatives revealed the extent of Matsunaga's isolation strategy. People remembered the Ogata family becoming less social, less visible over the years, but attributed this to normal life changes rather than anything sinister. A few people mentioned trying to contact family members and being told they were unavailable or had moved, but no one pushed hard enough to break through Matsunaga's carefully constructed barriers. This aspect of the case sparked significant discussion in Japan about social isolation and the importance of community connection, about how atomization and respect for privacy can sometimes enable horror to flourish unseen. The arrest and interrogation of Matsunaga revealed a personality completely consistent with the crimes he had committed. He showed no remorse, no empathy for his victims, no recognition that he had done anything wrong. Instead, he explained his actions in calm, rational terms, describing his system of control with something approaching pride, as if he had discovered some profound truth about human nature and power. Psychologists who evaluated him diagnosed him as a psychopath, someone completely lacking in normal human emotional responses, incapable of forming genuine attachments, viewing other people purely as objects to be manipulated for his own purposes. But the investigation also revealed Junko Ogata's complicated role in the crimes. While she had clearly been Matsunaga's victim initially, had been subjected to years of abuse before the murders began, she had also been an active participant in the murders of her own family members. This raised difficult questions about culpability and responsibility, about where victimhood ends and perpetration begins, about how to judge someone who was both abused and abuser. Ultimately, prosecutors decided to charge Junko posthumously, acknowledging her role while also recognizing that she too was fundamentally a victim of Matsunaga's manipulation. The trial of Futoshi Matsunaga would become one of the most followed criminal proceedings in Japanese history. But before the trial could even begin, prosecutors faced a unique challenge. They had a detailed confession from the surviving victim, they had physical evidence of a crime scene, they had financial records and documentation, but they had no bodies, and Japanese law required proof of death to secure a murder conviction. So how did they prove that 6 people were dead when no remains could be found? The trial of Futoshi Matsunaga began in 2005, 3 years after his arrest, and from the very first day it was clear this would be unlike any other murder trial in Japanese legal history. The prosecution faced the challenge of proving 6 murders without bodies, relying instead on the testimony of the sole survivor, the physical evidence from the house, and Matsunoga's own statements during interrogation. The defense strategy was equally unusual. Matsunoga's lawyers didn't deny that people had died, but they argued that the deaths were accidental, that the abuse had gotten out of hand, that Matsunoga never intended to kill anyone. The surviving girl, now 19 years old, took the stand and provided testimony that lasted for several days. She described in detail the system of control Matsunoga had created, the escalating abuse, the forced confessions, the way family members were turned against each other. She described each murder, who participated, who resisted, how the bodies were dismembered and disposed of. Her testimony was devastating in its specificity, in the terrible clarity with which she remembered details that most people would have suppressed or forgotten. But her mind, traumatized as it was, had recorded everything, perhaps as a survival mechanism, perhaps simply because the horror was too profound to be anything but absolutely memorable. Matsunoga himself took the stand, and his testimony shocked everyone in the courtroom. He admitted to the abuse, admitted to the murders, but showed absolutely no remorse. Instead, he described his actions as necessary, as appropriate responses to the failures and badness of his victims. He explained his system of control with professorial detachment, as if lecturing on an interesting psychological technique rather than confessing to one of the worst series of crimes in modern Japanese history. His complete lack of empathy, his inability to recognize the humanity of his victims, was so profound that it actually strengthened the prosecution's case, because it demonstrated exactly the kind of personality capable of committing these crimes. If you're listening from Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, New York, Chicago, London, Toronto, Sydney, or anywhere around the world, night has fully settled now, that deep quiet of the early hours when the world seems to pause, and perhaps you're wondering how the families of the victims processed this trial, how they coped with learning the details of what happened to their loved ones. But many family members chose not to attend, couldn't bear to hear the specifics, couldn't face the reality of how their relatives had died. Before we continue to the conclusion, please take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications to support our channel. The prosecution presented expert testimony from psychologists who explained coercive control, forced perpetration, and trauma bonding, helping the jury understand how Matsunoga could have maintained such complete dominance over multiple people for years without them escaping or seeking help. These experts testified that the surviving girl's participation in the murders didn't make her a willing accomplice, but rather demonstrated the profound effectiveness of Matsunoga's psychological manipulation. They explained that in situations of extreme control, particularly when control begins at a young age, victims can lose the ability to recognize that escape is even possible. Their worldview becomes so thoroughly shaped by the abuser that the abuser's logic seems natural and inevitable. Physical evidence was presented: the chemical residue from the bathroom, the electrical torture devices, the notebooks documenting years of confessions and punishments. Each piece of evidence corroborated the survivor's testimony, building a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse culminating in murder. Financial experts testified about how Matsunoga had systematically stolen from the Ogata family, showing premeditation and planning that contradicted his claims that the deaths were accidental. The defense attempted to portray Matsunoga as someone who had been trying to help the family, whose good intentions had been twisted by circumstances and by the victim's own behavior. They argued that the girl's testimony was unreliable due to her trauma and psychological damage, that she might have misremembered or misinterpreted events. But these arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence and Matsunoga's own testimony, which made clear that he understood exactly what he was doing and had done it deliberately. After months of testimony and deliberation, the verdict came in March 2007, guilty on all counts, 6 counts of murder, multiple counts of fraud and extortion, and various other charges related to the abuse and confinement of his victims. The judge's statement accompanying the verdict was unusually emotional for a Japanese court, describing Matsunoga's crimes as representing evil of the worst kind, deliberate and systematic destruction of human life and dignity for no purpose other than the exercise of power. The sentence was death, to be carried out by hanging, the standard method of execution in Japan. But the legal proceedings weren't over, because the survivor's status remained ambiguous. She had participated in murders, had wielded weapons, had helped dismember bodies, and while everyone acknowledged she was a victim, Some legal scholars argued she should still face criminal charges for her actions. So what happened to her? How did Japanese society ultimately decide to treat someone who was both victim and perpetrator, both survivor and participant? The question of how to treat the surviving girl became a matter of intense legal and ethical debate in Japan. Prosecutors ultimately decided not to charge her with any crimes, recognizing that her participation in the murders had been coerced, that she had been a victim of extreme psychological manipulation from a young age, and that charging her would serve no legitimate purpose of justice. This decision was controversial, with some arguing that participation in murder should always result in criminal charges regardless of circumstances, while others maintained that the decision showed appropriate recognition of the realities of coercive control. The girl was placed in protective custody and provided with extensive psychological treatment. Therapists who worked with her described the challenge of helping someone recover from such profound trauma that included not just what had been done to her, but what she had been forced to do to others. The guilt she carried for her role in the murders was immense, and working through that guilt, helping her understand that she had been a victim throughout, that her actions had not been freely chosen, would take years of intensive therapy. She was given a new identity and relocated to a place where she could attempt to build a new life away from the notoriety of the case. Matsunaga remained on death row for years. His appeals were all denied, and he showed no sign of remorse or change even as execution approached. Japanese death row conditions include extended periods of uncertainty. Prisoners are not told their execution date in advance, but are instead informed on the morning of their execution. Matsunaga experienced this uncertainty for years, though it's unlikely it caused him any of the psychological distress it causes most death row inmates, given his apparent lack of normal emotional responses. He was executed by hanging in 2011, 9 years after his arrest, and with his death, the case officially closed. For those in London, Birmingham, Dublin, New York, Los Angeles, Vancouver, Tokyo, Sydney, or anywhere experiencing the deep quiet of night, or in New York where evening continues, or in Sydney where the full light of day now shines, the story of the Kitakyushu family murders stands as a reminder of the darkest capabilities of human nature, but also of the resilience of the human spirit, because the surviving girl did survive, did rebuild, did find a way to continue living despite carrying memories and guilt that would seem unbearable. If this investigation has affected you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our true crime coverage. The case had profound impacts on Japanese society. It sparked discussions about social isolation and the importance of community connection, about recognizing warning signs of domestic abuse, about the psychological mechanisms of coercive control that can trap victims in situations of prolonged abuse. Mental health professionals used the case to educate about trauma bonding and learned helplessness, helping people understand how victims can become trapped in abusive situations that from the outside seem obviously escapable. Legal reforms followed, including stronger provisions for investigating suspected domestic abuse and better training for police and social workers in recognizing signs of coercive control. The case also influenced discussions about the death penalty in Japan, with supporters pointing to Matsunaga as an example of someone whose crimes were so heinous that execution was the only appropriate response, while opponents argued that even his case didn't justify state-sanctioned killing. The Ogata house was eventually demolished, the land cleared and sold. Neighbors reported that they were glad to see it gone, that the house had become a grim landmark, a reminder of the horror that had unfolded there. Nothing marks the spot now, no memorial, no plaque, just empty land where a family once lived normal lives before everything went wrong. The 7 victims are remembered primarily through court records and media reports, their lives reduced to footnotes in the story of their destruction. And that might be the saddest part of all, that Matsunaga succeeded in erasing them so completely that what remains is primarily the story of how he destroyed them. The surviving girl, whose name has been kept confidential to protect her privacy, is now in her late 30s. Reports suggest she has managed to build some semblance of a normal life, though the trauma she experienced will never fully leave her. She declined all requests for interviews and has chosen to live in anonymity, understandably unwanting to be defined by the worst years of her life. Her survival, her ability to walk into that police station and ask for help, ultimately brought justice for her family and prevented Matsunaga from claiming any more victims. In that sense, her courage, however accidental it may have felt in the moment, saved lives and ended a cycle of abuse that could have continued indefinitely. The Kitakyushu family murder case remains one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern Japanese history, not because of the violence itself, though that was horrifying enough, but because of what it revealed about the human capacity for control and domination, about how systems of abuse can be constructed that turn victims into perpetrators, that isolate people so completely they can't imagine escape, that destroy families from within by corrupting the very bonds that should provide love and protection. Matsunaga's crimes were exceptional in their systematic nature and their psychological sophistication, but the mechanisms he exploited, the psychological vulnerabilities, the social factors that enabled isolation, these exist everywhere, in every society, waiting to be exploited by those with the will to do so. And so the story ends where it began, with silence, the silence of a house where 7 people died, the silence of a community that didn't know what was happening just meters away, the silence of a legal system that struggled to comprehend and address crimes that pushed the boundaries of what seemed humanly possible. But within that silence, there is also the voice of the survivor, the testimony she gave, the courage she showed in speaking truth about unspeakable things, and that voice, however quiet, however traumatized, ultimately ensured that the story of the Kitakyushu family murders would be told, would be remembered, would serve as both warning and reminder of the darkness that can flourish when isolation, control, and human cruelty combine. Rain falls on Kitakyushu tonight, washing the streets clean, and life continues, as it always does, carrying forward the lessons learned from tragedy, holding space for the memories of those who were lost, and honoring the survival of the one who lived to tell their story.